Good day, I'm Dr. T and welcome to my office. So today I'd like to continue my discussion on ways to develop a course by moving on to how to teach the course. And in doing so, I'm going to take a few videos. So this is part 3A. I'm going to break up part 3 into several parts. So in part 1, we talked about learning objectives. Part 2, we talked about assessment. And now let's move on to how to teach the course. And as it would be appropriate for the first part of this, let's talk about lecturing. Because this is going to be one of the standard pedagogies. This has been the thing for almost forever. So simply telling the student what they need to know is a reasonable approach. There are some advantages and disadvantages to this approach. The disadvantages are fairly stark, and that is simply being told what you need to know and expected to remember that is not the most effective way to learn stuff. So as such, compared to more active learning approaches, lecturing typically does not perform as well for student learning outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean to say that it is inherently bad. It just means that you probably shouldn't be relying on it solely. There are some advantages to lecturing. For starters, you can cover a lot of content very quickly. If you look at some of my course playlists, they're a bit of a mess, but you'll notice they're all roughly 10 hours long. Same goes for crash course playlists done by Complexly, roughly about 10 hours long. And each one of these playlists roughly corresponds to an entire semester worth of content. You have more than 10 classroom hours in a semester, significantly more. So this does mean you can convey a lot of information very efficiently. And when you're looking at your learning objectives, you can mark off those that are high importance and those that are, well, not. And those lower value learning objectives can be stuck into your lecture and call it good. Now, the other advantages are that some students, it's just not going to click. If you're doing other more advanced forms of pedagogy, things like active learning, etc., sometimes the students just will not see it. And the best way for those students is simply to show them, to tell them just explicitly, here's what you need to know. Here's why this is this and that. And this makes lecturing a very nice backstop. You've got your potential active learning or your other pedagogies, and then before you've moved on, before the test, etc., you've got, okay, here is what you should have learned. Let's go over this. You can go fairly quickly. This is a reinforcement to the students who have learned it with the other approaches. This is clarifying any minor misconceptions. Major misconceptions, you're going to have more work with, but this should clarify any minor misconceptions that students have developed. And for those students who it just did not click, hopefully they'll see it when you spell it out plain as day kind of thing. Now, there are, of course, students that it will not, and they're going to struggle. Now, the last real advantage to lecture is there is some content where, let's just be honest, there isn't really another good approach. It's either arbitrary in nature, so-and-so did such and such at this point in time, or there is a pattern and there's a deep interconnection with things, but the connection is actually really far down in a fairly deep rabbit hole. If I'm teaching general chemistry, I'm only going to go so far into quantum physics. There's a lot of things where I do not want to try and explain quantum physics with, because this is general chemistry with like an Algebra 1 prereq, not a Calc 3 prereq. And as such, I'm just going to have to be, here's what it is. The connection is in quantum physics kind of thing. I'm not going over the connection, etc. So you've got some advantages, you've got some disadvantages. Odds are most courses, not all, but most courses are going to have some lecturing into them. I strongly encourage you, if you are using active learning, to either use in class or maybe a video lecture as a backstop, just as one more ability for students to learn the content and one last line to hopefully get those students that's just not clicking for them to get the content. Now, as you are lecturing, you've got a couple of choices, and basically it comes down to your visual aids, because you're probably going to want some visual aids. Just you sitting there talking, kind of like what I'm doing right now, this is awkward, maybe isn't ideal. So you probably want some kind of visual aid. Your choices are basically kind of twofold with a bunch of stuff in the middle. You can either have pre-created visual aids. So the classic PowerPoint. Here's the PowerPoint. Talk, 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 talk. Move the slide. Talk, talk, talk. Or as you guys say, click. Talk, 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 talk. And these are helpful, especially if you've got images that you couldn't draw. If you're taking things like photographs or you want a fair amount of detail. And these are really helpful for the students if you give the students to them in advance. And then they can print them off, maybe 3 on the side, the classic notes-taking approach. And that way they're not trying to transcribe all the content on there. There's a classic problem of students trying to transcribe your lecture or copy everything down, and you're not learning as much when you're transcribing as when you're actually thinking about the content and then processing it, then putting that down in the notes. So by giving them the PowerPoints, they're not as tempted to transcribe. Your alternative, kind of the other end, which would be your classic dry erase or chalkboard, is for you to create the visual aids in the presence of the students. They're being created live. And so this is going to work well when there's kind of a process going on. They're not going to be too complicated. So you're not trying to draw Aristotle's face, or it's an art class and you're talking about drawing faces, but you get the idea. But instead, you may be working out some math equations, or you're drawing a diagram, something that the students need to actually be able to do themselves. So not only are they learning what they need to put in their notes, what they need to think about, but they're also learning how to do it. And this gets into things like order. So if you're doing, once again, math equation, you'll notice math professors usually love chalkboards. Some of them go full on like chalk, not even dry erase, but true chalkboards. This gives a flow. When you're working a mathematical operation, you want to do this part, then this part, then this part, and you actually show the students you doing it part by part by part by part. Whereas if you were to simply put that on a PowerPoint slide, it would be a block of text, and you'd be talking about a block of text. Now, you could animate that text. There's ways to get in between. There's ways to do hybrids, but you're getting the general gist of your two approaches. So it depends heavily a lot on what your content that you're teaching happens to be. When I teach general chemistry, I'm all about the dry erase board and or the chalkboard. Pro tip, if you ever get the option to have glass dry erase boards, don't. They're terrible. But you get the idea. Whereas if I'm teaching biochemistry, I tend to lean a lot more PowerPoint because there's a lot of things in biochemistry that I'm not going to try and draw mitochondria and the whole electron transport chain. Well, actually I might. That's not that bad, but you get the idea. So if I am teaching biochemistry, I might lean much more towards the PowerPoint approach because it's more complicated figures, things that I don't really want to try and draw, and ones where there's not the advantage of being drawn on the board as there is with, say, working an equation or something in that fashion. So the question to you then quite often is the content one where I need to show the students how to do it, or is it something where it would be best off if it was in their notes when they came to class? And with that, I hope I've given you a few ideas. There are all kinds of interesting, annotated PowerPoints, cool technology solutions for this. So hopefully you'll explore a few of those, although I do like my good old-fashioned chalk. So with that said, have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in later videos.